The military trucks rolled down Maple Street at dawn, their steel treads grinding against asphalt that had never felt such weight. Children pressed their faces to windows, watching soldiers in combat gear pour from vehicles, like water from a broken dam. The morning light caught their weapons, sending sharp reflections across the quiet neighborhood where families had thought themselves safe. Sergeant Martinez stepped out of the lead vehicle, his boots hitting the ground with authority that echoed between the small houses. He surveyed the scene through tactical goggles, scanning for the armed separatist cell that dispatch had warned him about. The intel seemed solid enough. A concerned citizen had called 911 voice, trembling with fear, reporting suspicious activities, foreign weapons, and whispered plans of violence against American soil. But instead of militants, Martinez saw something else entirely. An elderly Somali man watering his garden, his hands shaking as he dropped the hose. A young Afghan mother clutching her infant to her chest, tears streaming down her face as she backed away from her front door. Children who should have been playing in their yards now cowered behind their parents, wide eyes reflecting a terror they had hoped to leave behind in their homeland. "Command, this is Alpha Team Leader." Martinez spoke into his radio, his voice carrying doubt that hadn't been there moments before. "We're not seeing any signs of hostile activity. Requesting clarification on the intel." The static crackled back with urgency. "Maintain your positions, Sergeant." Caller was very specific about the threat level. "Proceed with the sweep." 3 days earlier, Karen Whitfield had been standing in her pristine kitchen, staring out her window at the modest homes that had sprouted across the street like weeds in her perfect suburban landscape. She had moved to Millbrook 15 years ago when it was still what she called a real American neighborhood. Back then, the houses were occupied by families who looked like her, spoke like her, shared her values about property maintenance and appropriate holiday decorations. Now, as she watched Mrs. Hassan hanging colorful fabrics on her clothesline, Karen felt her jaw clench with familiar irritation. The woman's children were playing in the yard again, their laughter too loud, their games too foreign. Just yesterday, Karen had seen the teenage boy next door helping his elderly neighbor carry groceries, speaking in what sounded like Arabic. The sight had made her stomach turn with a mixture of disgust and something deeper, something that felt like fear. "They're taking over," she had whispered to herself, gripping her coffee mug until her knuckles turned white. First one family, then another, and another. Soon there won't be any of us left. Karen had always prided herself on being what she called observant. She noticed when the Ahmeds received multiple packages in a single week. She kept track of when the Refugee Assistance Center held their evening meetings. She documented every time she saw men gathering in the community garden, their voices low and urgent as they discussed something she could never quite hear. It was Tuesday evening when she made her first call to the local police. "I'm concerned about some suspicious activity in my neighborhood," she had said, her voice carefully modulated to sound reasonable and patriotic. "There's been a lot of unusual gatherings, people coming and going at strange hours. I just think someone should look into it." Officer Davis had taken her report with professional courtesy, but Karen could sense his skepticism through the phone. "Ma'am, from what you're describing, it sounds like normal community activities. The Refugee Assistance Center does hold regular meetings to help families integrate. That's perfectly legal." "But you don't understand," Karen had pressed, her voice rising despite her efforts to stay calm. "These aren't normal activities. They're planning something. I can feel it." When the local police dismissed her concerns, Karen felt the familiar burn of being underestimated, ignored, pushed aside by people who refused to see what was right in front of them. She had spent weeks documenting what she called evidence, taking photos through her blinds, recording license plate numbers, noting the times when groups gathered. She had built what she considered an airtight case, only to have it dismissed by officers too politically correct to acknowledge the obvious threat. That's when she decided to escalate. If local law enforcement wouldn't take her seriously, she would go to someone who understood the gravity of the situation. She had read enough news stories, watched enough documentaries about homegrown terrorism, to know exactly what words would trigger an immediate response. On Thursday morning, Karen dialed 911 with hands that trembled only slightly. She had rehearsed this conversation in her mind dozens of times, perfecting the tone of urgent concern that would convince the operator of the immediate danger. 911. What's your emergency? I need to report a terrorist cell operating in my neighborhood, Karen said, her voice breathless with manufactured panic. I've been monitoring their activities for weeks. They're armed, they're organized, and I believe they're planning an attack. The operator's voice sharpened immediately. Ma'am, I need you to stay calm. What's your location? Karen provided her address and began weaving her carefully constructed narrative. She described midnight meetings, where she claimed to have seen weapons being distributed. She spoke of overheard conversations about targeting local government buildings. She painted a picture of imminent danger that she knew would trigger every protocol designed to protect American citizens from foreign threats. They call themselves a community organization, she continued, her voice gaining confidence as the operator took detailed notes. But I've seen what they're really doing. They're using their refugee status as cover for something much more dangerous. Within hours, Karen's fabricated report had traveled up the chain of command, gaining urgency and embellishment with each retelling. By the time it reached the Department of Homeland Security, her observations had transformed into actionable intelligence about an active terrorist cell requiring immediate military intervention. The National Guard arrived at dawn on Friday, their convoy stretching for 3 blocks as they surrounded the Millbrook refugee community. Karen watched from her window as soldiers established a perimeter, their movements precise and intimidating. She felt a surge of vindication watching her neighbors' faces fill with terror. Finally, someone was taking her concerns seriously. But as the morning progressed, Karen began to notice details that didn't align with her expectations. The soldiers were speaking to residents with restraint rather than aggression. Instead of finding weapons caches, they were discovering children's toys and family photographs. The dangerous militants she had described were revealed to be elderly men playing chess and mothers hanging laundry. Dr. Sarah Chen, an investigative journalist for the Washington Herald, arrived in Millbrook that afternoon, following reports of unusual military activity in a civilian area. She had built her career exposing stories that others overlooked, finding truth in the spaces between official statements and observable reality. Something about the National Guard's presence in this particular neighborhood triggered her professional instincts. Dr. Chen began by interviewing residents, documenting their experiences and gathering their perspectives on the morning's events. What she discovered was a community of families who had fled genuine violence in their home countries, only to find themselves treated as enemies in the place they had hoped would offer safety. "We came here to escape war," said Amira Hassan, a widow who had arrived from Syria 3 years earlier with her 2 young children. "My husband died protecting our village from extremists. Now they tell us we are the extremists. How is this possible?" As Dr. Chen gathered testimonies, she began to piece together the timeline of events that had led to the military response. The 911 call, the escalation through multiple agencies, the deployment of National Guard units based on a single civilian report. The more she investigated, the more questions arose about the source of the intelligence and the motivations behind it. Her breakthrough came when she decided to examine the caller's background, Karen Whitfield's name appeared in the police report as the concerned citizen who had provided the initial intelligence. A simple property record search revealed something that made Dr. Chen's investigative instincts sing with recognition. Karen Whitfield wasn't just a concerned neighbor. She was the local representative for Meridian Development Group, a real estate company that had been quietly acquiring properties throughout the county for the past 18 months. More importantly, Meridian had filed preliminary paperwork for a major development project that would require the displacement of exactly the residents who had just been targeted by military action. Dr. Chen spent the weekend digging deeper into Meridian Development Group and its connections to Karen Whitfield. What she discovered was a sophisticated operation designed to manipulate property values and force demographic changes in targeted neighborhoods. Karen had been systematically documenting refugee families not to protect her community, but to build a case for their removal that would clear the way for profitable development. The company's strategy was elegant in its cruelty. By creating a perception of danger around refugee communities, they could justify forced relocations while simultaneously depressing property values enough to acquire land at below-market prices. Karen's role was to provide the human face of concern, the local resident whose fears would legitimize actions that might otherwise appear discriminatory. But Dr. Chen's investigation revealed something even more disturbing. The weapons and suspicious activities that Karen had reported weren't complete fabrications. They were descriptions of legitimate community activities twisted through the lens of prejudice and strategic manipulation. The late-night meetings were English language classes for working parents. The weapons distribution was a community tool library where residents shared equipment for home repairs. On Monday morning, Dr. Chen published her findings in a story that spread across social media like wildfire. Local woman's false terrorism report linked to real estate scheme. Read the headline that would eventually reach the desks of federal investigators and congressional oversight committees. The response was immediate and devastating. By Tuesday, the FBI had opened an investigation into Karen Whitfield and Meridian Development Group for conspiracy to commit fraud, filing false reports, and what prosecutors would eventually classify as domestic terrorism. The National Guard units were quietly withdrawn, but the damage to community trust had already been done. Karen found herself facing a situation she had never anticipated. Instead of being celebrated as a vigilant patriot, she was being investigated as a criminal conspirator. The same officials who had responded to her emergency call were now examining her financial records, her communications with Meridian Development, and her documented pattern of harassment against refugee families. "I was protecting my neighborhood," she insisted during her first FBI interview, her confident demeanor cracking under the weight of documented evidence. "I saw suspicious activities and reported them. That's what any good citizen would do." Agent Williams, a veteran investigator with experience in domestic terrorism cases, reviewed Karen's file with professional detachment. "Mrs. Whitfield, we have bank records showing payments from Meridian Development Group, totaling $47,000 over the past 18 months. We have recorded phone calls where you discuss strategies for forcing refugee relocations. We have documentation of your coordinated efforts to create false evidence of terrorist activities." The evidence against Karen was overwhelming, but the case had implications that extended far beyond one woman's criminal behavior. Her actions had weaponized federal emergency response systems against innocent families, turning America's security apparatus into a tool of ethnic harassment and economic exploitation. Senator Patricia Rodriguez, chair of the Senate Homeland Security Committee, announced congressional hearings within a week of Dr. Chen's initial reporting. "We must examine how our emergency response systems can be manipulated to target vulnerable communities," she stated at a press conference that was broadcast nationwide. This case represents a fundamental threat to the principles of equal protection and due process that define American justice. The Senate hearings began 3 weeks later in a packed chamber where the weight of national attention pressed down on every participant. Karen Whitfield sat at the witness table, her carefully styled appearance doing little to mask the fear in her eyes as senators prepared to question her under oath. Senator Rodriguez opened the proceedings with a statement that laid out the gravity of the situation. Today, we examine how false reports of terrorism can be used to terrorize the very communities our laws are designed to protect. We will determine how this happened, why it happened, and what steps we must take to prevent it from happening again. Under intense questioning, Karen's carefully constructed justifications began to crumble. When presented with evidence of her financial relationship with Meridian Development, she claimed it was merely compensation for community liaison services. When confronted with recordings of her coordinating false evidence with company executives, she insisted her words had been taken out of context. "Mrs. Whitfield," Senator Williams pressed, his voice carrying the authority of decades in public service. "You called 911 and reported an imminent terrorist threat. You claim to have witnessed weapons distribution and overheard plans for attacks on government buildings. Under oath, do you maintain that these reports were accurate?" Karen's response came after a long pause, her lawyer whispering urgently in her ear, "I reported what I believe to be suspicious activities based on my observations and concerns for community safety." "That's not what I asked you," Senator Williams replied sharply. "Did you personally witness the distribution of weapons to members of a terrorist cell?" The silence stretched uncomfortably long before Karen's voice barely rose above a whisper. "No." "Did you personally overhear conversations about planned attacks on government buildings?" "No." "Did you have any credible evidence whatsoever that the refugee families in your neighborhood posed a threat to national security?" Karen's composure finally collapsed entirely. "I was trying to protect my community. These people were changing everything, bringing their problems here, making our neighborhood unsafe." Her outburst provided the most damaging evidence of the entire hearing. In attempting to justify her actions, Karen had revealed the true motivation behind her false reports. It wasn't concern for national security that had driven her to weaponize emergency response systems against her neighbors. It was prejudice, fear, and greed disguised as patriotism. The testimony of refugee families followed Karen's collapse, each story adding emotional weight to the legal case being built around her actions. Amira Hassan spoke about her children's nightmares after seeing soldiers in their yard. Dr. Ahmed described losing patients who no longer trusted him after news reports labeled his community as terrorists. Each testimony illustrated the human cost of Karen's deception. But it was the testimony of Marcus Chen, Dr. Sarah Chen's younger brother, and a veteran of 2 combat deployments in Afghanistan, that provided the hearing's most powerful moment. "I fought alongside Afghan translators who risked their lives to help American soldiers," he said, his voice steady despite the emotion in his eyes. "Many of them died for that choice. The families who made it to America are here because they chose to stand with us against real terrorists. To have them targeted by fake terrorism charges is not just wrong. It's a betrayal of every soldier who served alongside them." The Senate committee's final report, released 6 weeks after the hearings concluded, was unsparing in its condemnation of Karen's actions and the systems that had allowed her scheme to succeed. The committee found that she had committed federal crimes, including filing false reports, conspiracy to commit fraud, and what they classified as domestic terrorism through the intentional misuse of emergency response systems to target a protected class of residents. Karen was sentenced to 8 years in federal prison, with additional restitution requirements that would strip her of most of her assets. Meridian Development Group faced federal charges that eventually resulted in the company's dissolution and criminal convictions for 3 of its executives. The civil lawsuits filed by affected refugee families would continue for years, ultimately resulting in a $40 million settlement fund. But the most significant outcome wasn't legal or financial. It was the transformation of Millbrook itself. The crisis had forced the community to confront prejudices that many residents hadn't even recognized in themselves. In the months following Karen's conviction, the neighborhood began organizing events specifically designed to bridge cultural divides and build genuine connections between longtime residents and newer refugee families. Amira Hassan, who had spoken so powerfully at the Senate hearings, found herself emerging as an unexpected community leader. Her experience navigating American bureaucracy while maintaining her cultural identity made her a natural bridge between different groups of residents. She began organizing monthly potluck dinners, where families shared food and stories, creating spaces for the kind of authentic human connection that Karen's fear and prejudice had tried to prevent. Dr. Sarah Chen's reporting had evolved into an ongoing project documenting community healing and resilience. Her follow-up articles tracked the ways that Millbrook residents were building something stronger and more inclusive from the wreckage of Karen's deception. The neighborhood that had once been divided by suspicion and manipulation was becoming a model for communities across the country facing similar challenges. 1 year after the National Guard trucks had rolled down Maple Street, the same street hosted a very different kind of gathering. Families from Somalia, Afghanistan, Syria, and Mexico sat alongside families whose ancestors had arrived from Ireland, Italy, and Germany generations earlier. Children played games that blended traditions from different cultures, while their parents shared recipes and stories. Sergeant Martinez, the National Guard leader who had questioned his orders during the original raid, accepted an invitation to attend the community celebration. He spoke briefly about the importance of military personnel understanding the communities they serve and the dangers of acting on unverified intelligence. His presence represented a kind of closure for families who had seen him as a symbol of threat rather than protection. "What happened here was wrong," he said to the gathered crowd, his voice carrying the authority that had once intimidated them, but now offered reassurance. "But what you've built in response is right. This is what American communities should look like." The federal government's response extended beyond punishing Karen and her conspirators. New protocols were established requiring additional verification for terrorism reports targeting refugee communities. Training programs were developed to help emergency responders recognize and resist manipulation attempts. Most importantly, funding was provided for community integration programs in neighborhoods with significant refugee populations. As evening settled over Millbrook that day, children from different families continued playing together while their parents lingered over conversations that were building friendships and trust. The community garden that Karen had once viewed with suspicion was thriving under collective care, producing vegetables that reflected the agricultural traditions of multiple continents. The small house where Karen had once lived stood empty, its windows dark and unwelcoming. Eventually, it would be purchased by a young Afghan family whose father had worked as a translator for American forces. They would plant flowers in the yard, where Karen had once stood, watching her neighbors with suspicion and resentment. Their children would play in the same spaces where Karen had once seen threats and foreign influence. Dr. Chen's final article in the series was published on the 2nd anniversary of Karen's false 911 call. She titled it, "From Fear to Fellowship: How One Community Healed After Manufactured Crisis." The piece documented not just the recovery from Karen's deception, but the ways that crisis had revealed strengths and possibilities that might never have emerged under normal circumstances. Millbrook today is stronger than it was before Karen Whitfield tried to tear it apart. Dr. Chen wrote in her conclusion, "The community that emerged from manufactured crisis is more diverse, more connected, and more resilient than the one that existed in comfortable separation. The families who were targeted by false terrorism charges have become leaders in creating the kind of inclusive American community that our founding principles envisioned." The story of Millbrook spread far beyond its small borders, becoming a case study in universities, a reference point for policymakers, and an inspiration for communities facing similar challenges. Karen's attempt to use America's security systems as weapons against vulnerable families had ultimately strengthened the very community she had tried to destroy. On quiet evenings, when the last of the dinner dishes had been cleared and children's voices faded into bedtime routines, Millbrook settled into a peace that felt earned rather than simply inherited. It was the peace of a community that had faced its worst instincts and chosen its better angels. It was the peace of neighbors who knew each other's names and stories. It was the peace of a place where children could grow up seeing diversity as strength rather than threat. The military trucks were gone, replaced by ice cream vendors and school buses. The fear that Karen had tried so desperately to cultivate had given way to the kind of ordinary human connection that makes communities strong. In the end, her greatest fear had come true. The neighborhood had indeed been transformed, but instead of the invasion she had imagined, it had become exactly what America had always promised to be: a place where people from different backgrounds could build something better together than any of them could create alone.